Somewhere in your head, there's a stock photo of a caveman. Ripped shoulders, sprinting flat out after a gazelle, abs you could grate cheese on. Every documentary, every meme, every gym bro quoting paleo leans on that exact image, and it's doing a lot of quiet lying. Here's the question hiding underneath it that almost nobody asks out loud. Could a prehistoric human have actually carried real extra weight, not a little soft around the middle? Genuinely, doctor's office lecture, can't tie your own sandals over weight. Keep watching, because the honest answer says something a lot more uncomfortable about the body you're sitting in right now than any gym poster ever will. You're already typing the obvious objection. They were starving constantly. They had to outrun predators. There was no drive-through window. Fair point, and not wrong, exactly. But not wrong, and the whole truth, are very different things, and evolution has a long history of quietly proving humans wrong about their own bodies. So let's set the scene properly. Around 300,000 years ago, anatomically modern humans show up. No farms, no grocery aisles, no stress eating a family bag of chips at midnight while doom scrolling. Just small bands of people hunting, gathering, scavenging, and occasionally stealing a kill from a hyena that made the rookie mistake of walking away from lunch. Scientists call this the environment of evolutionary adaptedness, a technical way of saying the world your body was actually built for, as opposed to the world you're living in now, which your body was absolutely not built for. In that ancient world, a calorie wasn't a threat. It was the entire game. Every single one you got into your body was a small victory against the very real chance of starving. There was no such thing as cutting carbs, only the constant low-grade prayer of please, let there be carbs somewhere nearby. You didn't get a handful of berries by tapping a screen. You got them by walking for hours, getting torn up by thorns, and hoping a bear hadn't found the bush first. Given all that, obesity should be flatly impossible. And for the overwhelming majority of ancient humans, it basically was. But basically is doing a lot of work in that sentence. And that's the crack we're going to pry open today. Here's the twist that unlocks everything else. Your body was never built to avoid getting fat. It was built to avoid getting thin. Sit with that for a second. Evolution doesn't care if you're a little chubby. Chubby doesn't kill you. Starving kills you. And it kills your ability to reproduce, which from evolution's cold accounting, is the only number that actually matters. So your body evolved an almost paranoid relationship with storing fat. Every spare calorie that wasn't needed immediately got crammed into fat cells. A squirrel stuffing acorns into a hole, except the hole is your waistline, and the squirrel is your pancreas, running on pure panic. There's a name for this, and it's one of the more famous ideas in evolutionary medicine, the thrifty gene hypothesis, proposed in 1962 by geneticist James Neal. The logic goes like this. Ancient humans lived through repeating cycles of feast and famine. Some weeks you stumbled onto a beehive or took down a large animal that fed the whole group for days. Other weeks the hunt failed for a week straight, and everyone ate bark soup and quiet regret. In that world, the humans who survived best weren't the efficient calorie burners. They were the aggressive calorie hoarders, the ones who packed on fat during the good stretches so they had a buffer for the bad ones. Over tens of thousands of years, that hoarding instinct got written straight into the genome, which means uncomfortably, you, watching this right now, are the direct descendant of the humans who were best at getting fat. Not the leanest, not the most efficient, the best storers. Your body is, biologically speaking, a trophy for gluttony. Congratulations, I guess. But having the hardware for fat storage doesn't automatically mean prehistoric people were carrying it. Obesity needs two ingredients: a body good at storing fat, and an environment that actually hands you a surplus to store. For most of prehistory, that second ingredient almost never showed up in large enough amounts for long enough. It's like owning a sports car on a street with a speed bump every 10 feet. The capability is there, the opportunity mostly isn't. Mostly. Not never. And that one word is hiding something worth digging into. Humans aren't the only species running this fat hoarding program. And looking at our relatives makes the human case click. Bears gorge before hibernation, because their environment gives them a short window of abundance followed by months of nothing. Certain migratory birds nearly double their body weight before a long flight, because burning fat reserves over open ocean beats starving mid-flight. Even chimpanzees pack on fat during fruiting season, and burn through it in leaner months. None of these animals are clinically obese, but they all share the same underlying math. When food shows up, take it, store it, and let later you deal with the consequences. Humans are unusually good at this for a reason most people never think about: the brain. It's roughly 2% of your body weight and burns around 20% of your resting energy, all day, whether you're doing calculus or just staring at a wall. Some researchers argue the oversized human brain and the aggressive fat storage instinct evolved side by side. An expensive organ needs a reliable energy buffer, and body fat is basically a battery pack. Human infants, notably, are born carrying a far higher percentage of body fat than the babies of almost any other primate, likely because that fat buffers the enormous energy cost of a rapidly growing brain. So the same machinery that gave you poetry, rockets, and internet arguments about football is tangled up with the same machinery that gives you a muffin top. Evolution's sense of irony is unmatched. Now, back to the actual evidence that some ancient humans really did carry serious extra weight. We tend to picture the caveman as one uniform figure, but pre-agricultural human societies were scattered across wildly different environments. Frozen tundra, lush river valleys, coastlines packed with seafood, and in a handful of those environments, food wasn't scarce. It was abundant, reliable, almost relentless. Take coastal and river communities with access to massive, predictable food sources: salmon runs, shellfish beds. A group living beside a river that fills with thousands of fish every year like clockwork isn't riding the same feast or famine roller coaster as a group chasing unpredictable herds across open plains. That's closer to a calorie subscription. Archaeological evidence from Pacific Northwest coastal populations suggests some groups had food surpluses reliable enough that they built semi-permanent settlements, stored winter food in bulk, and developed complex social hierarchies, things usually associated with farming societies, not foragers. Groups near massive shellfish beds could walk to the shore and collect a low-effort meal whenever the tide allowed, no risky hunt required. When food gets that consistent, the conditions for real extra weight stop being theoretical and start being plausible. And here's where it gets interesting. Think about one of the oldest known pieces of human art, the so-called Venus figurines. Some date back more than 25,000 years, and they turn up across a huge stretch of territory, from what's now France all the way to Russia. A striking number of them share the same features: wide hips, large breasts, a pronounced rounded belly, full thighs, not lean, not athletic, by any modern measure, fuller-bodied. Archaeologists still argue over what they meant. Fertility symbols, idealized bodies, even self-portraits distorted by a woman looking down at her own body. Nobody knows for certain, and any explainer that claims otherwise is overselling it. But here's what matters for us. An artist had to have actually seen a body like this to carve it with that much consistency, across thousands of miles and thousands of years. You don't invent a rounded belly and full thighs from nothing. Long before anyone had seen a magazine cover, somewhere, ancient people were looking at real, visible body fat, and finding it significant enough to carve into stone and ivory. But figurines aren't a medical chart, so let's check the bones. This is paleopathology, the study of ancient disease through skeletal remains. And skeletons turn out to be surprisingly talkative. Obesity itself doesn't leave a direct fingerprint on bone the way a fracture does, but its downstream effects do, especially in the joints. Excess weight puts chronic stress on the knees, hips, and lower spine, leading to osteoarthritis, worn cartilage, and telltale bony changes at the joint surface. Researchers examining ancient remains have, in certain cases, identified joint degeneration consistent with excess weight-bearing stress in individuals who otherwise appear to have lived long, well-fed lives. Rare, not the norm across the fossil record. But rare isn't the same as non-existent, and that gap is basically the whole point of this video. Here's the part that flips the modern script entirely. For most of human history, obesity wasn't a marker of poverty. It was a marker of wealth. If food is scarce for most people, who's the one person guaranteed steady, abundant access to it? The chief, the leader, the person other people bring food to as tribute. Across early chiefdoms and later empires, a larger body was often a walking billboard, visible proof that you'd made it. It's only in the last century or so, once cheap, calorie-dense food became available to nearly everyone, that the whole thing flipped. Leanness became the new status symbol. Ironically, because now it's the wealthy who have the time and money for the gym membership and the $8 kale salad, while everyone else runs on inexpensive, calorie-dense fast food. Evolution did not see that plot twist coming. Neither did we. It's worth checking modern hunter-gatherers too, since we obviously can't scan an actual Paleolithic body. Groups like the Hadza in Tanzania, who still forage today, show remarkably low rates of obesity and related disease even into old age, often used as proof that cavemen were universally lean. But here's the catch. A lot of pop science videos skip. Modern foraging groups aren't a perfect stand-in for every ancient population that ever existed. They tend to occupy marginal land that farming societies didn't want, which is largely why they survived into the present at all. A population living beside an endless salmon run 12,000 years ago, and a population foraging on semi-arid savanna today, are not necessarily living the same version of the hunter-gatherer experience. Using one to represent the other is a bit like assuming the whole world eats the same meal because you looked at one restaurant menu. So, zooming all the way out, for the overwhelming majority of people living the classic feast or famine forager life, full obesity was extremely unlikely, simply because the caloric surplus needed to get there almost never lasted long enough. Your average Paleolithic human was almost certainly lean, not because the body rejected fat, but because the environment rarely handed over the chance to keep it. But under the right conditions, a reliable coastline, elevated status, plain genetic luck, some ancient humans absolutely could carry real significant weight. That thrifty, fat-hoarding machinery has been sitting in the human genome for 250,000 years, patiently waiting for an update that would finally let it run wild. And the update didn't come from salmon runs or ancient chiefs. It came from agriculture, and then, far more explosively, from industrialization. When humans shifted from foraging to farming roughly 10 to 12,000 years ago, everything changed. Instead of chasing calories across a landscape, you could grow them in one place, store them in granaries, and pull from that store on demand. That was, on balance, a massive win for population growth. But it came with trade-offs. Skeletal evidence from early farming societies shows a new cluster of problems that barely existed before. More dental decay from all that new starch, shorter average height, lower bone density compared to earlier foragers, and yes, growing evidence of weight-related joint stress in certain individuals, especially those higher up the social ladder. Then came the industrial world, and the floodgates didn't just open, they came off the hinges. Refined sugar, refined flour, industrial oils, food engineered by actual flavor chemists to be maximally Moorish, available around the clock, often cheaper than the vegetables sitting beside it on the shelf. That thrifty gene never went anywhere. It's still in you, right now, running the same subroutine it's run for 250,000 years. The problem is, the famine it was built to survive stopped showing up, at least for most people in the developed world. So the hoarding just keeps running with nothing to counterbalance it. Your body treats a trip to a fast food counter like it might be the last meal before a famine, because as far as your 200,000-year-old programming is concerned, it has no idea the gas station down the street sells food 24 hours a day, forever, no matter what. This is what scientists call evolutionary mismatch, a trait that was once a life-saving advantage turning into a liability, simply because the surrounding world changed faster than biology could keep up. Evolution runs on a clock of thousands of generations. The modern food environment showed up in about 2. Your genes are still reading a survival manual, written for a world that, for most of us, doesn't exist anymore. Picture a tribal leader 3,000 years ago, seated at the head of the fire, first pick of every meal, visibly well-fed as living proof of status. Now picture someone tonight, pulling up to a drive-through window at 11 p.m. Different centuries, different context, almost nothing in common, except the exact same genetic instructions, quietly doing the same job it's always done: store now, survive later. One of them was showing off wealth. The other has no idea he's running ancient software. The honest answer, in the end, is a nuanced one, and there's no point pretending otherwise. Most ancient humans probably were lean, not because their biology hated fat, but because the world rarely gave that biology room to work. Their bodies loved fat, desperately, and were remarkably good at keeping it, whenever the opportunity showed up. It just didn't show up often, or for very long, or for very many people. But when it did, a fish-choked river, elevated status, plain genetic luck, the evidence says ancient bodies were more than capable of carrying real, substantial weight. So the next time someone shows you a cartoon of a lean, muscular caveman hurling a spear at a mammoth, you can tell them, calmly, that the full picture is messier and far more interesting. Every person struggling with weight today isn't fighting some kind of personal failure. They're fighting a system engineered over hundreds of thousands of years to be almost impossibly good at exactly one job, keeping you alive through hard times. Most of us are now living through the easiest food environment our species has ever faced, and that ancient machinery has no idea what to do with the sudden abundance. No, the caveman on the cave wall probably wasn't fat, but somewhere, beside some lucky river stuffed with fish, or seated at the head of some ancient fire with first pick of every meal, there was almost certainly at least one very well-fed, very comfortable human. Proof that even hundreds of thousands of years ago, the body was always ready to seize an opportunity, and it was never going to let that opportunity go without a fight. Which raises the question worth sitting with. If your ancestors' biggest evolutionary win was getting almost impossibly good at holding on to fat, what does that make the modern diet industry actually up against? Drop your theory in the comments.